Now, a very interesting feature that Express.js brings onto the plate is the support of something called as a middleware, right? With the word middleware, I believe the first thing that might come to your mind is kind of like a middleman, right? Something that is doing somewhere in the middle. So let me show you the documentation, and the documentation are super cool and are very easily understandable. And this gives Express.js a very cool and interesting feature for us to easily implement the validation layer or the middleware layer inside our MVC. Middleware Express. So you can Google about Middleware Express. There's a very good article on expressjs.com. You can say that Express is a routing and middleware web framework. So the two major things that Express support out of the box is the support of routing and the support of middlewares. Routing we have already seen. If you guys see, we have already seen routing and everything, right? Now what is this middleware? Let's try to understand that middleware thing. Okay. So middleware functions. So middleware, first of all, is a function, right? So middleware function are functions that have access to the request object, rec, the response object, res, and the next middleware function in the application's request response lifecycle. The next middleware function is commonly denoted by the variable name next. So let's just focus on these three lines. These three lines says that the middleware function has got access to the request object. Who else has the access to our request object? Our controller function has the access to the request object. The middleware has access to the response object as well. Who else has the access to the response object? Our controller has an access to the response object. Can I say that? So we can say that middleware are definitely very closely related to controllers. Now, one interesting fact that apart from the request object, the response object, it also has access to the next middleware. So what middleware looks like is something like this. So let me actually help you with the diagram. Okay. Okay. So let's try to understand it like this. Let's say you have a client. Okay. Let's say you have a client here. Okay. Pretty simple. Client makes a request. Okay. Client makes a request. And let's say the request goes to your routing layer. What is your routing layer? This routes folder is your routing layer, right? Here you have configured all the routes. So you go to the routing layer. Okay. Cool. Now, currently what's happening is that when you go to the routing layer, let's say you go to the routing layer, from the routing layer, you are redirecting yourself to the controller. Currently what is happening? You are redirecting yourself to the controller. Okay. Controller. Okay. This is the request lifecycle. And what happens is client makes a request. Client makes a request. This request is then accessible. Let's do it like this. This request is then accessible inside the controller. This request is accessible inside the controller. Can I say that? This request is accessible inside the controller. Now, what are middlewares? What middleware will do is between your routing layer and the controller layer, what you can do is you can set up not one, but multiple middlewares. Okay. So let's call it as middleware 1, middleware 2, middleware 3. And these middlewares are nothing but some functions only, right? So you can say middlewares are also functions, right? This is something that you have to keep in mind, that these are also nothing very special, or they are not a new entity altogether. These are also just some functions. But the best part about these functions is that they actually get embedded between your routing layer and the controller layer. Because of which what happens is that from the routing layer, request goes to the first middleware. Then from the first middleware, request goes to the second middleware. From the second middleware, request goes to the third middleware, and so on. And then whatever is the last middleware forwards the request to the controller. That's why the documentation also say that middleware have access to the request object. So this HTTP request object that came, every middleware will be having access to this request object. Just like how controller function has access to this request object, right? So whenever an HTTP request will be coming, what will happen is client will initiate a request. You will end up in the routing layer. How? Because you have a socket connection prepared. So it will check the port and the route, and whatever route is there, that route can forward the request to one middleware. That one middleware can forward the request to the second middleware, and so on. Then whatever is the last middleware will forward the request to the controller, right? So these are kind of like chain of functions, right? Kind of like a linked list. If you can see that this is the head, this is the next node, this is the tail node. So these middleware kind of like forms the body of your linked list. And the best part is that whatever is the request object coming, every middleware function has the access to the request object. Now, if you see the controller also has got access to the response object. What is the response object? This response object is the object that you are going to send back to the client. Can I say that? This response is the object that you are going to send back to the client. Can I say that? And even middlewares have got access to this response object. Okay, so we call it as response. Okay, so any incoming request, all the middlewares as well as your controller will be having access to that request object. And what response you have to create? Controller is responsible for what? There are two responsibilities of the controller, if you remember. One is to forward the request to the service layer so that business logic can be implemented, and then prepare the response object. So you can see it will prepare the response object. Now how the response lifecycle will look like is, response will be forwarded to the last middleware. Then last middleware will forward the response to the second last middleware, and so on. And when the response comes back to the first middleware, then through the same socket connection, you are going to send back the response to the client, right? This is what middlewares do. Let me show you an example. So let's see if they have given some simple. I'll show you one simple example like this. Okay, cool. Let's say there is a function. Log original, and there is a function log method. Let's say this log original and log method are middlewares. So if you remember the definition, middleware have access to the request object, response object. So if you carefully see, they have access to the request object, response object, response object. But they have access to one more thing. They have access to the next middleware function as well. And in our case, the next log original is the first middleware. The next middleware to the log original is log method, right? And so on. So you can see they have access to the next parameter as well, right? So this is one middleware function, this is another middleware function, and this is your routing and the controller. See, now what's going on is you prepared an array. Inside that array, you put both of the functions, and after the URL and before the controller function, you put your middlewares. Can you see this? So let me also show you with an example. Okay, so let's come here to the ping router. Okay, so let's say I'll create a function check request. Okay, I'll say that this function has access to the request object, response object, and the next middleware. Okay, next denotes the next middleware function in line. Okay, cool. What we are going to do is we are going to say console.log checking the request. So here you can check the request, what the request is coming, how does it look like, is there any validation problem or not. And if everything is good, if everything looks good, we call the next middleware. Okay, so you will call next. Now next is pointing to a function, right? So we'll just call next. Can you see? So check request has access to the request object, response object, and the next middleware. So if everything looks good to you and you want to forward the request to the next middleware, you have to just call the next middleware. So let's implement one more middleware, log or logger. Again, has got access to the request object, response object, and the next middleware. You'll say console.log, logging request. And then if everything looks good, then call the next middleware. And you call next. And let's say we have one more middleware, function auth checker, that whether you are authenticated or not. I'm just writing hypothetical situation. Next, I'll say console.log auth checked. And then again, I'll call the next middleware if everything looks good. Cool. So you can see I have prepared 3 functions. There is a common trait in these 3 functions that all of these 3 functions have got access to the request object, the response object, and the next middleware. From check request, I'm calling the next middleware. From logger also, I'm calling the next middleware. From auth checker also, I'm calling the next middleware. Now what you can do is, whenever you are mapping your route to a controller, you can say, you can pass an array. Inside this array, you put, let's say, the name of the functions. So check request, logger, and auth checker. Save it. And let's see how the request looks like and how things work. So I'll do npm start. Okay, the server is up. Now let's say I'll do a ping request. I'll do a ping as a get request. Send it. And you can see the ping completed. And if you carefully see what happened, you first of all printed checking the request. Then you printed logging request. Then you printed auth checked. Can you see? In the same order, you're calling everything. Can I say that? And let's do one thing. Below the next call, I'll do one more console.log. Ending check request. Okay. Then I'll do a console.log. Ending log request. And here I'll do ending auth request. And let's see now what happens. You can see the server restarted due to nodemon. If I send the request again. Now can you see what is happening? You printed checking the request. Why? Because you are inside this middleware. So you printed checking the request and you call the next middleware. What's the next middleware? Logger is the next middleware. So you call logging request. And then you call the next middleware. What's the next middleware? Auth. So you call auth checked. And when all of these are done, then you call the controller. When controller sends a response back, so can you see what was printed first? Ending auth request. So the last middleware has got access to this. And there is a very simple explanation to this. I'll tell you in a moment. But you can see after that, you are ending log request. That is present here. And after that, you are ending check request. Right? Ending check request. So if I show you diagrammatically, what's happening is that, so let's say everyone knows that there is a call stack, right? There is a call stack. So inside the call stack, what's happening is that you have your middleware one, or let's name the middleware one as check request. Okay. Check request actually calls another method, logger. Can I say that? It calls another method, logger. And whenever you call a method, what happens in the memory? Because all of this code is going to be executed in the node runtime. So you have access to a call stack, right? So what happens when you call the function? This next is pointing to logger. What happens when you call the function? It actually adds an entry to the top of the call stack. So this logger function gets added to the top of the call stack. Then logger calls one more function. Logger calls one more next, which is pointing to auth checker. And how Express understand what is next pointing to? Based on the order of the middlewares you put here. If you put logger before check request, then logger will be executed first, right? Here I have check request before logger, so check request gets executed first. So logger calls next. So what is after logger? Auth checker. So auth checker is going to be called. Okay. So here we are going to call auth checker. And then if everything is good inside auth checker, you call next. Now the good part is that the final controller method, Express, treats it kind of like a terminal middleware only. The final controller method here, Express treats it as a kind of like terminal middleware only. So let me write a console.log here. Controller hit. Okay. If you save it, can you see after the last middleware auth checked, you are printing controller hit, because when you now call next inside auth checker in this middleware array, do you have anything after auth checker? No. So what it will pick? It will pick this controller function. This next is pointing to the ping controller. And which method of ping controller? Yeah, ping controller only. This next is pointing to auth checker. And this next is pointing to logger. Okay. So that's how the life cycle goes. That's how the life cycle goes. Right. That's why after auth checker, you actually call your controller method. Ping controller. Now what happened is check request had access to the request and response object. Then the same request and response object got into logger until unless you have made any modifications, of course. Then you pass the request response object inside auth checker. Then you pass the request response object inside ping controller. Now when ping controller returns from here, can I say that you are back inside auth checker and you left auth checker when you called next, right? Because the moment we call a function, the earlier function gets halted there and waits for the completion of the execution of the function that you have called. So now you're going to be at line number 29 waiting, and the moment ping controller returns, you're going to come back to line number 29, move to line number 30, and then print auth request. That's what's happening here. Ending auth request. And when you do end auth request, you have not returned explicitly anything. So it will automatically return and you come back to logger. That's why you print ending log request, because this next has been completed. This auth checker has now been removed from the stack. You resume your execution with ending log request. And then at last you have check request. So you print ending check request. So this is the whole philosophy of middlewares. Now the best part about middlewares is that even if you don't want to put it like an array, you can remove the array and just comma separated put all of the middlewares like this. The array based syntax makes it a bit more clean to understand, okay, there is a middleware component going on there. But if you don't want any array like syntax, so what you can do is after the route, just keep on passing comma separated middleware function names and at last put the controller function. If you see, if I send it, still everything works as it is. So that is what middlewares are. That these are middleman functions that exist between your routing layer and the controller layer, which have got access to the request object and the response object and access to the next middleware as well, right? They can modify the request object. In fact, what can happen is, let's say you made a request to check request forward the request to logger forwarded it to auth checker. Now auth checker checked that you are not authenticated. So if you're not authenticated, you should not hit the controller. So what will happen is, from here only, instead of calling next, we will say if not auth, then we will call return response.json message not okay. Okay. So this kind of a interception we can actually do using these middlewares. That at any point of time you realize that, okay, auth checker check that you are not authenticated. If you're not authenticated, then you cannot hit the ping controller. So you don't need to call the next function. You can just return directly from here. If you return directly from here, the call comes up here and then here. This is how actually middlewares work, right? And now what can be the use case of middleware? Any kind of an interception in the incoming request object, if you have to do, you can use middlewares. For example, validation, that if the incoming request is a valid request or not, right? Or let's say some logging you want to do for the incoming request. All of these actually account for middlewares. So in the previous section, we discussed about this syntax, which was kind of like weird and new. app.use. What is this app.use? So inside the whole Express framework, there will be a lot of times where you will be using a bunch of middlewares. App.use is also kind of like a middleware. So let me actually show you app.use. App.use Express. Okay. Let's go here. Okay. Cool. Application level middleware. What is application level middleware? Bind application level middleware to an instance of app object. This is the Express app object using app.use. So what is application level middleware? Can you say that? These three middlewares are only applicable when you make a get request to /API/v1/ping. If we make a request to /API/v2/ping, you can see request goes, but there is nothing printed. Why? Because these middlewares are only working for one API. But let's say you want some middlewares to work for every request that comes to your service or every request that comes to your system. For every request, if you have to do something, then you set up an application level middleware. Application level middleware means app level middleware. That every request that comes to the app, we have to handle that. How do we handle that? What kind of middleware we put into the picture? That's coming here, right? So that's why you will see at any point of time something like app.use. Then for every request that is coming, if that request starts with /API, you go to API router. Things like this. You already have seen app.use kind of syntax. So if I import body parser, once again, what's the package name like? Is it having a hyphen? I forgot. Body parser Express. Okay. So you just have to do body hyphen parser. Body hyphen parser. Okay. Now, if you remember, we used to do something like that. App.use, right? And then we used to use the body parser functions. If you remember, let me show you. Something like this. Body parser.json, body parser.text, body parser.url encoded. So body parser.json, app.use, body parser.text, app.use, body parser.url encoded, and here we have to pass extended as true to check the algorithm, right? Which algorithm we are picking. So now what's happening is that again app.use helps you to register application level middleware. So any request that comes to your application, for all of that request, you allow JSON parsing, text parsing, and URL encoded parsing. So for every request you configured that before the request reaches the controller, for every request, you are intercepting that request with some middlewares. These are those middlewares. Because before it reaches the controller, it will reach these functions, right? Same thing here. Before it reaches the controller, it goes to first of all API router. From then v1 router, then ping router. And then inside ping router, you go to ping controller. So before you reach the controller, anything that is intercepting your request is a middleware. So these are actually intercepting your requests. So these are also middlewares, but these are application level middlewares. Same thing like this. So that's what app.use helps you to do. It helps you to register application level middlewares. That's kind of like very important. So you can say app.use and you can have a callback function that you can pass. Inside this function again, because it's a middleware, you have access to request, response, and next. You call the next. Things like this. Right? So it's a very powerful tool. And this tool will actually help us to make the validation layer possible inside our system. So apart from your just body parser or maintaining the, let's say, routers or writing your own middlewares, there are some custom packages that provide you some very handy middlewares. For example, there is a package called as response time npm. Okay. If you Google about this package, you go here. What's the use of this package is, let me show you. This module creates a middleware that records the response time for an HTTP server. The response time is defined here as the elapsed time when a request enters the middleware to when the headers are written out to the client. So what we can do is we can do npm install response time. One second. Copy. Yep. I guess there was a spelling mistake. Cool. Then what do we have to do? We have to require response time. So let's say I'll require it in my index file. I'll do a const. Okay. Cool. And then can you see what do? We do app.use response time. That means for every incoming request, we are setting up a middleware that is going to track their response time. Let's do that. So app.use response time. And can you try to understand the order in which you are configuring these middlewares is necessary to be correct? Why? Because middlewares are also just functions. So if you will calculate the response time after body parser has done everything and after the routing has been done, then it will not show you the correct time. The moment request enters the system, before any conversion of the incoming request body or anything, you should start tracking your response time. This should be the ideal case, right? So the order in which you are calling the middlewares is going to be very important. Now if you start the server, right, and send it, you can see still things are working, right? Okay, it's not logging anything for us. Let's quickly see how can we make it log the response time. Let's see. Okay, so it accepts some options. It expects some options. Let's see. So let's close this. Okay. And so if you carefully see the docs here as well, so it doesn't log the response time for you. It is not going to log the response time for you. But instead, if you carefully see, then it's going to set a header x response time. So whatever is the response object, the request object also has a header, the response object also has a header. So it is going to set a header for you x response time. So if I send the request and if I check the headers, can you see there is a header x response time, which is 5.299 milliseconds. If I send it again, you can see every time response time is different because of the computation lifecycle. If I remove, let's say, response time middleware, see, I have commented it out, right? Now what's going to happen is, if I send it, can you see we are not getting any x response time header. So this is going to help you elapse the or calculate the x response time. This is pretty cool, right? And you can see some more options that are available, right? For example, there is this response time function, and you can pass a function as well. This create a new middleware that records the response time of a request and makes it available to your own functions. The fn argument will be invoked as request response time, where time is a number in milliseconds, right? So let's say, let's try to experiment with this. So let's say if I pass a function here, f, with the request, response and time, and let's say I do console.log time. Let's see what happens. And let's call it as time elapsed is equals to this. Okay, let's see what happens. Now the server restarted. If I send the request, okay, can you see now what's happening? We are able to print the time elapsed. We are able to print the time elapsed altogether, right? Now, if you see, there is no header coming up. Why there is no header coming up? Because we have overridden the default time function here. We have overridden the default callback function here with our own callback function, right? Now, if we have to send the time to the header again, then what do we have to do? We have to say response dot set header x, let's call it the same thing. What was it? X response time as time. Okay, let's see if this works or not. If I send the request, now can you see, now X response time is coming up because we have our own callback function here. We have overridden the default functionality. The default functionality was setting a header. Now if we want our own functionality, you can pass a function to the response time function, which is registered as a which is registered as a middleware. And inside this function, you can console.log and then set the header manually yourself, whatever you want to do. Okay. But I believe instead of this, a simpler use case can be something like this. Okay. A simpler use case can be something like this. If you send it, you can see now response time is automatically coming up, no logs as such. So I'll commit everything up till here. Demo for middlewares. And you are able to, I believe, see that again the same thing that is given by the documentation is true. That for every request, this is a app level middleware, application level middleware. Any request that comes up, we are going to start recording the response time for that particular request. So this is something that you have to very carefully keep in mind. So now technically we know that how exactly the routing will work, middlewares will work, and controller will work. Now is a good time to start implementing our first API. Okay. What I'll do is I'll do a small cleanup. Right. We don't need these middlewares now. Just a small cleanup. I believe everyone now knows the syntax. So we are going to use the middlewares, but I'll show you separately. Okay. So middlewares you can see are just functions. So we can segregate them out in their separate folder altogether, but we'll come to that. Okay. And yeah, everything here should be good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start preparing an API. Okay. What this API is going to do is it is going to prepare a kind of like a product for us. Okay. So how this API should look like is create product. Okay. Create product. In this create product API, what we are going to do, the request type should be a post request. We are going to make a request to localhost 3001 /API/v1/products. Okay. I'll make a post request to /products, and in the request body, I'm going to send some product parameters. And these product parameters are going to be used in order to actually create a product altogether. This is the API that we have to implement. If you make a request here, if I do npm start, currently we have not implemented the API. If you make a request, you can see we are just returning products with an empty array. Why? Because if you go to the code, let's close everything. Let's go to our index.js file. If any request starts with /API, we go to API router. The remaining URL, if it starts with v1, we go to v1 router. If in the remaining URL it starts with products, we go to products router. And you can see there is a post request for the products that we have already configured, right? So this is the good time where we are going to actually start implementing our new product API altogether. Okay, cool. Now, how things should work, what we should send, let's start actually talking about it. Okay, so what we are going to say is that, let's say, in order to create a product, we are going to send a title. Let's say the title of the product looks something like, you can say Apple iPhone 15 Pro. Okay, then let's say there is a price. Okay, there is a price, let's say $1,000. Okay, and there is a description. Okay, let's say lorem ipsum, some description will be there. Okay, there will be an image of the product. Okay, so let's get an image of iPhone 15 Pro. iPhone 15 Pro image. Okay, transparent background. Let's try to take a transparent background images, and let's see. Okay, let's try to save this and see if it has a transparent background. I don't think it has a transparent background. Yeah, nope. Let's try to find one. Because on the front end, we will definitely need a transparent background. No. Okay. Let's search for a PNG. PNG. Generally, PNGs are transparent. Save image as this. Nope. So I found this image, this iPhone image, which is having no, you can say, background. So you can do copy image address. If we search for this image address, you can see this is the image. Or in fact, what you can also do is like, let's say, go to Amazon, search for iPhone, right? Directly from there, you can also get some images because, let's say, search for iPhone. This one, okay. And let's say, copy image address. Yep, something like this. Okay. So let's keep that. Or you can take this one as well. So let's take this one. Okay. And we will put it here. Okay. So the image is there. We have the image. So I'm defining the contract. I'm defining the contract that how exactly things should look like. And let's say there will be a category. There will be a category. And let's say we'll pass the category as, let's say, electronic. Okay. So let's say this is going to be the request body. All of these are mandatory parameters. If you don't send any one of them, then maybe let's say we are going to make the request go stale, or let's say just send a response that things are not working well. Okay, cool. Now, if you try to send this request, you can see we are still returning the same response because this is defined like this. So let's make things cleaner. So first things first, we need a controller here, right? We need a controller. So I'll create a new file, product controller.js. I'll write a function, create product. This create product function is going to have a request object, response object, and we are going to say module.exports create product. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we are going to say, let's say, try catch console.log. Let's say if any error happens, we'll say something went wrong, and we are going to print the error. Okay, cool. And for the timing, let's say some db processing we will do, and post that we are going to say return rest.json. Okay, we'll define a JSON, and let's say in the response JSON, let's say if you try to give a response JSON, what we are going to do is we are going to return something like this. Let's say we'll say ID as some random number. So math.random. Okay, some ID. Let's say I'll do what into $20, something like this. Okay, and then we'll be having a title. We'll return a description, or let's do it like this. Let's say we'll define the response as, first of all, success true. So inside our response JSON, we are going to have a success true parameter. Error will be an empty object. Okay, because if the request went successfully, then we don't need to send any error. So error will be an empty object. This success key value pair is going to tell us whether the request was completed successfully or not. Okay. There is a message parameter if you want to send any extra messaging for any pop-ups or anything. So let's say successfully created a product, right? And let's say there is a data property. If the request went successfully, let's say I'm going to return a data property. Okay, we'll try to refine this response object later, but now in the data property, let's say I'm going to send all of these details: title, description, and then category, then price, and then image. Yeah. Okay. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, cool. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to mimic an API. What's happening is that technically though, if we create a product, this product should persist in our database, right? But we have not currently connected our database altogether. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just, let's say, going to call up some random DB processing. Let's say we will assume that some DB processing is going to be done. And if any error happens, then we are going to come to catch. But if everything goes well, we are going to return this JSON. Okay. So see how the request will come up. If the request has API, we go to API router, then V1 router. Products, we go to product router. Inside product router, if it's a post request and there is nothing after /products, then what we are going to do is instead of calling this, we will say const create product is equals to require controller / product controller, save it, and we are going to map it to create product. Let's see. Okay, so the server restarted successfully. Now if I send the request, now can you see what's happening? The request has halted altogether. Nothing is happening. Strange, right? It says sending request, but nothing is happening. Let's try to debug what might not be going well, because you can see we are sending a post request altogether, right? So the request looks good. There is something else that might not be going well. If you go here, can you see we have the access to the request object and the response object, right? Okay, cool. Now you're calling return rest.json. Let's do one thing. Let's do a console.log successfully created product. Let's see if the call is coming even up till here or not. Okay, now send it again. Now can you see things are working, right? So I guess there was some temporary issue altogether. I guess this file was not saved. Oh yeah, this file was not saved. That's why it was not working. Let's remove it, save it. And now if you send it, can you see we are getting that overall response altogether, right? We are getting a response altogether. This is working fine, right? You can see success true, error, message, and inside the data property, we are getting all of this. And everything I feed it as empty. So this is coming like this. Okay, cool. You can see this is the whole life cycle of the request. But we have to do request body validation also, because currently we are going to say that if any one of these 5 properties are not there, we are not going to fulfill the request. So for that, we need middlewares. We are going to create a folder, middlewares. Okay, inside the middlewares folder, I'm going to write a file, product middlewares.js. I'll write a function, create product middleware, or let's say create product validator. Okay, this is a middleware function. So it will be having access to the request object, response object, and the next middleware. We will check if not request dot body dot title or not request dot body dot, or let's just do something like this. Let's just do it for title only. We'll say that if the request body is not having the title, we are not going to let the request go forward. From here only we are going to say response.json success false, data empty. Okay, and then message title not present in the incoming request. Okay, and let's say the error object, let's see, this is the error object. Okay, inside the error object, I'll say message as request body received without title. Okay, and let's see anything else. Yeah, let's do something like this. Okay, that's all what I want to do as of now. So if in the request body we are not able to detect the title, we are going to return directly from here. But if we detect the title, if everything looks good, we are going to call the next middleware. And if create product validator is the last middleware, then what's the next middleware? The controller is the next middleware. So what you do is you come here, you say const require middlewares, product middlewares, and sorry. So let's do one more thing. Let's do module.exports, create product validator, create product validator. So you can see I have the middleware now. And what I can do is I can just map this middleware here. So now what's going to happen is if any post request comes to this route, we're going to first of all check the product validator. If product validator is all good, then only the request will go to create product controller method. Okay, let's try. So let's stop sending the title. Can you see I've stopped sending the title? If I now send the request, it says success false, title not found. The moment I start sending the title, it gives us this, right? This looks super cool, right? This looks super cool. So just like this, what we are going to do is we can have the other properties as well, right? Let's say title. Similar to that, we can have description, right? Description not present. Then we can have a price not present. Then let's say image not present, okay. And apart from image, there should be what? Category not present. And now what's going to happen is if let's say if I don't send description not present. If I don't send image not present. If I do not send description and image, then you can see the first check is for description, right? So you'll only get the error messaging of description. So you can see description is not present. As simple as that. So now you can see we are able to validate our request as well and then forward the request to the controller. But there is still a problem. This code looks ugly as anything, right? This is looking ugly as anything. So what you can do is you can see every time you are creating a same kind of a response object, right? You're getting same kind of a response object every time. Can you see that? Okay. So what you can actually do is you can now create a utils folder. If you remember, we talked about utils, that these are utility methods. If I create a new file, I'll call it as error response.js. Okay. I'll say const error response is equals to a JSON. Okay. Or let's call it like this, function error response, and it's going to return, let's say an object. This object looks like this. Okay. This object looks like this. And we'll say because it's an error response, so success will be always false, data will be always empty. There should be a message. So we can get a message here, and whatever is the message, I'm going to pass that message directly here. Okay. And let's do one thing. So we'll send a error object, and whatever is the error object, we are going to send that directly here. Okay, we are going to send this error object, and we'll say module.exports error response. Okay. And now what you can do is instead of calling this method like this, right, you can just call error response. Inside that error response, first of all, you can pass your message and you can pass an error object. Okay. You can pass an error object. Inside that error object also there is an error message, and let's say for the timing I'll paste the same thing. Okay, now you can see this is now a one-liner altogether. If now you send it, let's say you don't have the title, you can see things are coming up like this. So we can replace it like this, but there are still more problems. First, can you see we were not able to find, or let's say the incoming request body was malformed, but the status code that we are returning is 200. Okay, that's problematic, right? Technically the status code should be 400, bad request. There is a status code 400 HTTP code. You can see it's a bad request. So we should technically send bad request, right? How can we send that? So this response object can help us configure that. How? You can say res or response dot status, and then you can say status as 400, and then you can say dot JSON. So you can see we are chaining the methods. How we are able to chain the methods? Let's think about it. The status function is available on the response object, and the JSON function is also available on the response object. For example, you can do something like this. You can do res.status, just res.status, or you can do just res.json, right? Both of the functions are available on response object. So what happens is when you call res.status, this status function sets the status code as 400 and then returns the response object only. So res.status eventually returns the response object only where the status code has been set as 400. And then you call res.json, and this res.json also returns the response object, because at last you have to just return this, right? Technically at last you have to just return the response object, right? So if you do res.json, so res.json also returns the response object. And if you do res.status, then res.status also returns the response object. On that response object, you call the .json method, and then finally whatever response you got, you return it here. So you can say that every method that we are chaining here is returning this res variable only. If now you send it, can you see we are getting a 400 bad request, right? This looks cool. But there is still problems. What are the problems? Can you see we are configuring the messages like this, right? That error messages like this. This is not the correct way to maybe handle the messages, okay? Because think about it. Every time we are going to again and again just copy paste this object and paste everywhere. That should not have been the case. That's why we have one more folders called as exceptions. Okay, or you can say errors. Okay, you can say errors. I'll create a new file. I'll call it as let's say bad request error.js. Okay, I'll write a class. So there is a class called as an exception class. Let me show you that. Okay. Or let's see custom exception type. So if you at any point of time you have to create a custom exception type, so there is a class called as error. So there is an error class, right? See, there is an error class. What is this error class? Let's read about it. Error, yes, not exception, it's error. You can see. So the error constructor creates an error object. Every error object can have access to a message, some option, some file name, some line number, all of these things, right? See, what's the line number? Line number within the line on which file the exception was raised, right? So what we can do is, now this is what? This is a generic error object. One thing that I could have done is that here, in the middleware, I could have just created a error object. We could have said, let's say new error object, and I could have, let's say, passed the message like something. This is something that we could have done. If I save it, right? And if I send the request, can you see we are getting an error object, right? We are getting an error object altogether, right? But that's not what we want. That's not what we want, because just saying new error doesn't make the code readable. What error? No details is coming up. So what we can do is we can say class bad request, right? We can say a class bad request that extends error. Okay, so you can see bad request extends error. This class we can write just like how they are writing it here. Okay, so you can see there are some errors like syntax error, type error that you regularly see. These actually extend these are subclass of error class only. See, when you raise a syntax error, then you're able to understand, oh, this is a syntax error that is coming up. Okay, so just like this, what we're going to do, we are going to have a constructor with this message. Okay, so let's say we'll be having a constructor with a message property, right? And what we are going to call, we are going to call the super constructor. Super constructor is the constructor of the parent class. So we'll call the super constructor with message object. And let's say this bad request, I'll say this dot status code as, let's say 400, something like this. Okay, so we'll add a status code property also, right? Something like this we can actually do. And we'll say module dot exports bad request class. And here what we will do is we will say new bad request and let's say some message. We'll say some message. Okay, save it. And now if somebody reads the code, they are able to automatically understand, oh, it's a bad request that has been sent. Okay, now if you send it, can you see we are getting the bad request error object with the status code as 400. Okay, but if you carefully see, we are not getting the message. We are not getting the message. Can you see? We are not getting the message that we have transferred to the error class. Can we say that? So technically what happens is that this error object, let's say if you use bad request, right, internally, which is calling error object only, right? If you use this, then every error object has a message property, but this message property cannot be just directly get accessible anywhere, right? Because this is not an enumerable property. You can actually read about it. So that's why what do you have to do is, let's say here you created this new error object, right? You do const x is equals to new error object, and instead of passing x, you can pass message colon x dot message, something like this. Try to pass something like this. Let's see if you send it. Can you see now the message property is getting accessed? So there's a concept of serialization and deserialization of objects, right? What is serialization? Whenever an object is, let's say, sent from a client to the server, it gets serialized because JSON is what? Almost text, right? But the network doesn't understand direct text. It has to be segregated in the form of packets. So some interconversion actually happens to actually send data from one client to server. And then on the server side, it is deserialized. When you create an error object inside JavaScript like this, right, the message property is not directly deserialized. If you want to deserialize it, you have to separately access it in an object like this. So here, what we can actually do is we can extend the error class, and we can say status code is 400, and we can say this dot message as message. Okay, and now let's remove this. Let's say we'll create a new bad request exception. New bad request exception missing. I'll just say missing. And now if you send the request, okay, sorry, just a second, bad request. Sorry, we'll call it as this dot error message. Error message as message. Okay, we'll remove console.log. Okay, what happened? Error message is not defined. Oh, sorry, this is just a message, or let's call it as error message only. Save it, send it, and now you can see we are able to access the error message here. And we know that in bad request, mostly the error message will be pretty much consistent, right? So you can say, you can just say property missing, and you can create the error message here. Const error message is equals to property missing is missing from the request body. Okay, and then this same error message we are going to access here. If I save it, so instead of missing, I'll say title. Save it, send it. You can see title is missing from the request body. How cool is that? Right? So you can see pretty clean code, and we are able to see, okay, we are going to raise a bad request exception altogether. Right? So these are some things that you have to kind of like always keep in mind before you actually start preparing your production level code. Now you might be thinking, sir, if you are just setting your own error message property, own status code property, then why you are even extending the error object here? Extension of error object gives us one very crucial functionality. Let me show you. So there is a property of the error object that we can use called as, let me show you this one. Okay. Stack trace. Let's try to see the stack trace. Okay. So JS error stack trace. Okay. So if you see a code example like this, see, we are throwing a new error, right? We got some new error here and there. And now what you can do is, if at any point of time you have to access the stack trace of the error, that why the error happened, maybe for your logging purpose, you can actually access that. For example, let's say we will say that console.log we'll create a new bad request here. Okay, const error is equals to new bad request, console.log err.stack. Okay, and we'll pass this error object here. Save it, send it. You can see still the same message we get, but now you are able to print your stack trace as well, that where exactly the exception happened, right? And this will be only possible if you are extending your error class. If you do not extend your error class, let's say if you do not extend your error class, and let's say you do not call the super, you will realize one thing. If you send it, still the response will come, but you do not have access to any stack trace. This call of error.stack is now going to be empty, because access to stack trace is is easily and directly given by the error class that you are extending. So now if you save it, send it again, and you can see you again have access to the stack trace or the error stack trace, right? So this is one benefit of actually raising things like these. Okay. So let's, for the timing, I'll remove it for the timing, because this is pretty much verbose. So I don't need anything here, right? But now you can see we have kind of like reduced the whole bloated code like this. Okay. And in fact, let's do one thing. Let's replace this here as well. This time, this one is title not present. This one will be description not present. And in the bad request also, I'll send description. So if I save it, and if I don't send the description, send it, you can see, okay, my bad. Are we sending the title? No. Oh, my bad. So I'm sending the title now. If I send it, see, now description is missing from the request body. As simple as that. So things are actually taking shape. And I'll improve this one more level, but for the time being, I'll just cut paste this and cut paste this. Here we will call for price. We will call for image here, image, and we'll call for category here, category. Now if you do not send anything, let's say you don't send category, a proper error messaging you are getting. Okay, and everywhere you get 400 bad request. How cool is that? And if you send everything, then you are able to get a brand new product as well. But in this brand new product, you can see title and everything is empty, right? So currently I've kept it as empty. Why? Because I'm just hard coding the data. I'll implement the logic as well. I'll implement the logic as well. Currently, I just hard coded the data, so I've kept it empty. But technically, what you can do is you can say request dot body dot title, right? Because now the request will come to create product controller function if and only if this middleware is passed, this validation middleware is passed, right? So request dot body dot title, request dot body dot description, request dot body dot category, request dot body dot price. I'm just hard coding, so doesn't matter much, but still image. Save it and now send it. And you can see now I have all of the details coming from the request body. If any one of the detail is missing, you can see image is missing now. If all of the details are good, you can see we are getting 200 okay. So the default status code that you return is always going to be 200 okay. And you can see we have shaped up our first REST API, at least on the controller part, where we have a routing layer, where we have a controller layer, we have a validation middleware coming up in between, which is registered here. So I'll commit all of this. I'll make more changes as a follow-up, but I'll commit all of this here. Added basic validation to create product API. Here we go. So currently, if you will see the application, what you can see here is that we are hard coding the error response code 400, right? It would be pretty hard for us to always remember the error response code. So there is an interesting npm package. So this package is named as http status codes. Search for npm. Okay, so it's kind of like a verbose enum, kind of like a mapping for all of your status codes. For example, if at any point of time you have to use something like internal server error or bad request, you can just say status codes dot internal server error, something like this. Okay, cool. So let's see. Let's just quickly see this. So I'll install HTTP status codes. So we'll install HTTP status codes. I'll turn up the server. And now if you have to use any kind of a status code, what we will do is we will say const require HTTP status code. So this HTTP status codes return us an object. From that object, we are going to destructure something called as status codes. How do I know it? On the documentation, you can see import this from this. So they are using ES moduling, right? So they are getting status codes, right? And now what we can do is we can say status codes dot bad request. Okay. Everywhere now you can replace it with status codes dot bad request. Something like this. And now what will happen is if now you send the request, let's say without the title, you can see we are still getting 400 bad requests without even hard coding 400, right? Something like this. So you can actually read about it. You can see these are the status code. These are all the status code that are mapped here. There are something called as reason phrases as well, right? So if I go to the documentation, right? So you can see they have some mocked reason phrases, right? Something like this here. So let's say, let me show you. So inside my error response here, what I can do is I can say reason phrases, and let's say I send reason phrases dot bad request. Okay. So then if I send it, you can see in the message we are getting bad request also, right? So our error message is already identifying what should be the corresponding, I would say, details. So here in the message, we should just say bad request. Okay. So what I can do is in the error response function, I can get, let's say, let's call it like reason phrase. Okay. And we will pass the reason phrase here, or let's call it like this, reason phrase. Okay. And we go here and we'll just pass the reason phrase, and this same thing I'm going to just copy paste everywhere. Okay. So same to same thing, I'm going to copy paste everywhere. So whatever reason phrase you have corresponding to your request, you can actually pass that. Okay. Cool. See, things look definitely more cleaner. And just for better refactoring, you can write it like this in every new line. Okay. JSON. So this becomes a bit more readable after the refactoring. Okay, something like this. And the same thing we can actually implement inside our controller as well. If you carefully see, if you go to the controller, currently in the controller, when you are actually creating a object successfully, you are saying 200 okay, but instead of 200 we should send 201. So we should say res dot status. Okay, so here we should send a status 201. If you save it, send it, you can see now we are getting 201. But instead of hard coding it like this, a good way would be const status codes is equals to require http status codes, and we should say status codes dot created. Okay, and if you send it, now you can see we are still getting 201, right? And let's say instead of saying successfully created a product, if you say let's get reason phrases, and let's say you pass a message with a reason phrase dot created and send it, you can see you are getting message created, right? So you can write something like reason phrase dot created plus product, and now it says created product, something like this. Okay, generally this message property is used for the front end. If let's say they want to show some pop-up notification or anything, that can be server driven. We'll talk more about how we can have nice API response structure, but definitely this API response structure also looks good to me. Okay, so I'll commit this much. Added HTTP status codes. Here we go. Now you can see our initial layers, like you can see already we don't have much of a code and we have a bunch of folders already, right? Things are definitely shaping up, right? Now what we are going to do is we are going to start moving towards the service layer, or you can say the model layer, which will be having models, services, and repository. So what I said earlier was that the role of the controller is never going to be implementing any business logic, nor it will at any point of time connect to any database, create database, fetch data from the database, nothing. Its only responsibility is to get the data, pass it to the service layer, and prepare the response structure based on the response. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder, services. Okay. I'm going to create a new folder, services. Inside the services folder, I'll say product service.js. Okay. And let's say what we're going to do is we'll say function create product, function create product. Okay. And let's say I'm going to prepare a in-memory DB. Okay. I'm not connecting any MySQL or any kind of a database. I'm preparing an in-memory DB. How this in-memory DB looks like? Let's say const products is equals to an empty array. Okay. And here what we are going to get is, you can see we have access to the request body, right? So what we are going to do, we are going to call this function with a product. Okay, we're going to call this function with a product. And let's say what we're going to do is we'll say products dot push. I'll just do one simple thing, products dot push. Okay, and I'm going to say const new product is equals to, we'll get all of the properties destructured here, and I will say ID should be products.length. Okay, something like this. And we are going to push this new product inside the products array. And from here, I'm going to return new product. Okay, and we'll say module dot exports create product. So what's happening here? I've created this new service file. This service file will be having all of our business logic. Currently, if you see, there is not much of a business logic because we're just creating a new product, right? But let's say later you want to implement something like ordering a product from the e-commerce app. So when you are ordering, you are placing an order, you have to do multiple steps. You have to check the inventory, whether there is enough items of the corresponding product available or not. Then you're going to check whether the payment has been done or not. Once done, then you're going to decrease the quantity of the product and then create a new order for the user. Multiple steps you have to do. Those are the business logic things. Those things are actually the business logic. So currently our implementation is very simple because we just want to create a product. That's why you won't see much of a business logic inside service layer. But later you will realize that step by step, when the application becomes fairly complex, service layer is going to have a lot of code. Okay. But for the timing, you can see I have created an in-memory DB and I'm just directly accessing the DB. Ideally, I mentioned that any kind of a DB interaction should not happen with the services. There should be a repository layer. But for the timing, because I'm going layer by layer, step by step, let's say I'm going to do just this thing, that I'm going to create a product like this. Okay. This is cool. This is cool. So now what will happen is here, I'll say const response is equals to, and let's say const create product is equals to require services slash product service. Okay, we'll call create product with request dot body. Okay, and then whatever is the response, I will put the response directly here. Okay, I'll put the data as response. So let's see. So now if I send it, sorry, the server is not up. Let's turn up the server. If I send it, 1 second, it says create product has been already created. Okay, let's do one thing. Let's say, let's call it as product service, and we say product service dot create product, and now send it, and you can see we're getting a new product. If I send it again, can you see the ID is changing? Can you see the ID is changing every time when you send, because all of those products are actually going inside my in-memory DB, right? This is working pretty cool, right? And now what you can actually do is you can expose one more API. Let's say you go to routes, v1 routes, product router. Let's expose one more API. And this time we'll call this as a get request. For a get request, we don't need any validator. And we'll say get products. Okay. Get products. We are going to implement a function get products inside our product controller. Let's implement it. Function get products. Okay. What this function is going to do is, let's say we'll print the error, and here we'll say const response is equals to product service dot get products. Okay. And inside the product service, I'll also implement a get products. Okay. Function get products. This is just going to return our products array. Whatever is the in-memory DB that we have prepared, it is just going to return that. And similar kind of a response we are going to prepare here. This time the status code should be okay, and message should be successfully fetched the products. Okay. And yeah, we're going to export this. And now if let's say instead of post, you make a get request, also let me make a new request altogether. Add request, fetch all products. It's a get request. Copy the same URL, paste it here. And if I make the request, currently you can see, one second. So if I go to product router, we have to remove this get request. We have to remove the old get request. Once done, once again, there's an error coming up. Get products is not a function. One second, product service. Oh, my bad. I have not exported get products. Send it. Response is not defined. Just a second. Response is here inside get products for controller.js. Oh, my bad. This should be res here, and it will be having access to the request and the response object. Okay, so it's a controller function, right? It's a controller file. So controller should have access to request and response. Send it. And now you can see there is no product. So no product is coming up. Now we go to create product, and let's say we start creating our product. So you can see we've created our first product. Now if we'll try to fetch the product, can you see we are able to fetch the products? So now we have kind of like an in-memory database. It's inside our RAM. If we restart the system, or we close the terminal, or the server gets restarted, this memory will be wiped out. But you can see it's kind of like working as a DB for us. So let's say iPhone 14 Pro I'll add, let's say iPhone 14, send it. So now we should have two products. So if I go to fetch all products, send it, and now you can see we have two products coming up, right? 200 OK is the request response coming up. So you can see how things have segregated is that from the product controller, we are actually calling product service. This product service will be having all of the business logic. In this business logic, there can be some algorithmic implementations, any kind of a DB interaction that it will do through the repository layer, any kind of a business logic, any kind of a payment related data, everything that is critical business logic is going to go inside product service, right? Controller is never going to implement any logic. It is just going to pass on the call to the product service. Product service should never interact with the database. Database interaction should always happen through repository, right? But you can see for the timing, this overall API definitely looks good to me, right? That you are able to implement something like this. So I can implement one more API very quickly. For example, let's say this time we need a function get product. We'll get a product ID, and we have to return the details of a particular product. So we'll say return products.filter. We'll go to each product where product.id is equals to the given ID, right? And we are going to return the 0th index of it. So let's export this get product method. Now in the controller, I'm going to write one more method, get product. Okay, get product. This get product is going to call get product of our service layer. And how do we get the ID? So if you remember, the URL should look something like this: /API/v1/products/2, something like this. Okay, so in the router, the URL will look like :id. Okay, this kind of a URL will be there. So here we can say request.params.id. Okay, and that's it. If you save it, and let's export the get product from the controller and bring it here and bring it here. See, redundant stuff. Now let's see. If you try to get all the products, you can see there is no product. Okay, let's create a product. We created one product. Let's create another product, iPhone 13. Let's create another product, iPhone 12. Now get one product. Okay, we'll say localhost 3001/API/v1/products/2. I want to get the second product. If I send this request, now can you see we're able to get iPhone 12. If I get the 0th product, we are getting iPhone 14 with the ID 0. First product, we are getting iPhone 13. And we already know how it's happening. Why? Because if you see the life cycle, if the request starts with /API, we go to API router. After the /API, if the remaining URL starts with v1, we go to v1 router. In the remaining URL, if it starts with /product, we go to product router. And in the remaining URL, if there is any variable ID, you can see nothing is above is matching, but this is matching. So we go to the get product function of our controller. Get product. Okay. Cool. Now here we call product service.get product. Inside product service.get product, we have implemented our business logic. So filtering the data, let's say, for the time being, let's say it's a business logic because it's a logical implementation. So we have implemented that inside our service layer, right? So I believe now you got the segregation between controller and the services. Services will include business logic. I have not yet introduced the repository, which is going to actually access the data from the database because we have not yet set up the database connections. But I believe this much part is definitely making sense. So we'll say git add all, git commit -m, added basic in-memory DB based service layer. Here we go.